Good afternoon. My name is Angelo Otterbein. I was class of 1991, and I'm delighted here to have today speaking with Michael Makarovich. And maybe we could just start with your interview with Jack Ordeman.
Oh, okay.
And what year was that when you first arrived? Just give us a little.
Okay, well, it's coming on to 50 years ago that I had this interview in this building. I had taught for 4 years in Baltimore City in Southern High School, which was near where I grew up, Brooklyn. There are like 24 Brooklyns in America, and one of them's in Baltimore, and that was my part of the town. And, kind of a poor area, and taught there. And then I fell in love and moved to New York for a year, and I was editing math textbooks. And when I came back, I couldn't get my old job back at Southern High School. They offered me some middle school stuff and all, but I thought, I can't teach that age people. And so I didn't know what I was going to do. And so I was looking in the classifieds, what will I do with my life, in the summer of '73. And
you were in your 20s at this point?
I was in my mid-20s.
Okay.
And don't fact check this. And there was an ad for a math teacher at a private school if you had 3 years of teaching math and a master's. And that was I. This was for me. It was from an employment agency. So I got this job and had to pay $600 to the agency to get it. When I got the job in New York at Holt, Reinhardt and Winston editing math texts, the employment agency paid the fee. But here they had to do it. But it didn't matter, I wanted this job. So I came out here, and I'd never seen a campus this beautiful. I still think today it's the most beautiful campus in Maryland.
It is.
High school or college. This valley, this Georgian mansion.
So you came up Falls Road, up the hill.
Yes, the
and
big
turned
hill.
into campus.
I never heard of this school before. Never heard of St. Paul's. Never heard of private schools.
Do you remember being nervous?
Very nervous. I had a motorcycle, but I thought that's probably not a good first impression. So my friend Betty lent me her van, and I didn't even have a summer sports jacket. Somebody loaned me a winter wool jacket. I had long hair, so I puffed it under, and had this interview.
And it was the middle of the summer.
It was the middle of the summer. And so, and then I had 2 interviews. So I was called back for the second interview. And one reason I think I had an advantage is that there was a wonderful woman I taught with at Southern High School from Little Rock, who was a great English teacher. And I asked her to write a letter of recommendation. And it wasn't until my 20th year here that I was able to look in my file. And this letter was so spectacular that, like, not only will he teach math, but he'll be a creative force, intellectualism, all this stuff that she wrote that of course came to pass. And Jack had read that letter. But anyway, it was down to an East Indian man in a turban and me. I had not met him, but I knew it was we were the 2 finalists. And when we finished the second interview, when he opened the door, there was Lillian Lorenz, his secretary, who became a lifelong friend after that. And she and the headmaster's wife, Mary Ordeman, when he opened the door, they almost fell in because they were like listening. And then when I left, they said, well, what's happening? And he said, I just hired that young man. And Lillian said, have you taken leave of your senses? And so that was the beginning. And Lillian became a really lifelong friend. And I would always stop to see her coming back from lunch from the cafeteria. And her desk was outside the headmaster's office, always a Chesterfield burning in the ashtray. And then we would chat. And I wasn't quite sure whether they wanted me here. I didn't know if I could.
You mean this is before you took the job? Or you
mean
once you did?
So I got the job, right.
Gotcha.
And in the first class, I'm wearing like velour bell bottoms and a printed flower tie, and I thought, I'll be cool. And I look out and it's this preppy look that I had not been part of this world. And it was like $60,000 worth of orthodontia in one class. I thought, they looked at me and I looked at them and I thought, on what planet have I landed? But we connected. Eventually I would say something about homework or something, and one of the kids said, we don't do things like that at St. Paul's. And I said, okay, let me adjust. But as the year went on, if they said, we don't do things like that at St. Paul's, I said, yes, you do. And you do it in this room. But after a couple of years, I thought, I don't know if I'm valued or do I fit in. And then I noticed that they have a yearbook, a really pretty good yearbook. And the dedication of the yearbook is usually somebody who's been here like 20 years or something like that.
Yeah.
And so after about 2.5 years, I'm down in the cafeteria, and the yearbook comes out, and somebody gives me a yearbook, and it's dedicated to me. What? So I couldn't wait to come up from the cafeteria to see Lillian. And I showed her. She's puffing on the chest. I said, Lillian, look, they dedicated it to me. She said, I told Jack he should have hired that Indian. And so that was my wonderful relationship with Lillian Lorenz, who taught work here for 40 years.
Yeah. And so it really didn't take you long to start making your mark. And you did that in a lot of different ways. Did it just show up to you that you knew you wanted to do this thing and this thing? For instance, maybe you could talk a little bit as one example of the film studies program.
Okay, well, when you're hired at a school, and there were like 18 teachers in the upper school, 160 kids. I do remember that the tuition was either $1,700 or $2,700 a year. I think as of this recording, it's about 27,000. And it's at least doubled the student population. But at the time it was small, so everybody on the faculty had to do something besides just their subject. Mm-hmm. And I'm not a big sports person, so I wasn't going to coach a sport, and I wasn't going to do a chess club. One of the reasons I was hired was I had some writing published. So I was advisor of the literary magazine called The Monitor.
But you came in as a math teacher.
As a math teacher, and to advise the literary magazine. But after a couple years, I'm looking around, and there wasn't much in the way of arts. There was some drama that I didn't think was very good. Yeah. And if there was art studios, it didn't make an impact. There was no music.
Was there even a theater?
No, it was done on a makeshift stage in the gym.
Okay, that's right.
And it was, really, I thought, terrible. And but students were involved, but there was of course, no dance, no music of any kind, no jazz band, no choral, nothing. Wow. There was the choir, but it had nothing to do with school. It was done at the church. They may rehearse in the middle school, but there was no music on campus, not like today, which is alive with it. So I thought there's going to be some more art, and so because I like movies, I thought, well, maybe I'll do a film course. So I went to the Maryland Institute of Art and took some filmmaking courses and started a film course, and it exploded. For 20 years, we were like 20, 25 guys in the class, winning national awards. We won in the county and the state and the national awards, best teenage filmmaker in North America, stuff like that. They were mostly controversial films, and so the faculty didn't always like them, but the students did. So at the end of each year, we did an assembly with student films, and it was like the voice of the student was there in that assembly.
So the classes that you took at Maryland Institute, did you have the support of Jack to do that, or did you just go and take them?
I just went and did it.
You just went.
That
and did
was the nice thing about a little private school. Are you certified to teach this? Did you go through this process? What about this committee? You could take some interest, and if you could get their backing, you could run with it. So it was mostly for personal creativity of the students, but some have gone on. Lorenzo Milan won an Emmy for sound design of House of Cards, which was a Netflix series. Scott Buckler, brilliant guy, just won an Emmy for John Oliver HBO show. Lots of patents he has on filmmaking equipment. He has a whole company, Scotty Cranes. And one of our students, Mark Pellington, made 5 feature films. He won Director of the Year. Sharon Stone gave him his award for a video of Pearl Jam's Jeremy. And lots of TV work. And I mean, some of it, that wasn't the reason to have the course, but some have gone on.
Now, when you mentioned a couple of students just now, did you see that in them?
Oh, yeah.
You could tell that you had lit the spark.
Yes. I noticed Scott Buckler, when he was like an 8th grader, when I was still doing the Monitor, kids would submit things. I would never make the choices. It's your magazine, not mine. And so one of the submissions came from an 8th grader, and I thought, what is that? They said, but you got to see this. So it was about a guy who couldn't get close enough to his best friend. So the climax of the story was he goes to his best friend's house, knocks on the door, takes a knife and rips open his torso, pulls out his innards, and buries his head in his chest.
Oh
and
my
I
gosh.
thought, this is interesting stuff. And this is Scott Buckler, who today has all these patents for filmmaking. His grandfather on one side designed the building, City College on 33rd Street in Baltimore. Beautiful, beautiful building, a high school. And his great-grandfather on the other side invented the cigarette rolling machine in the 19th century when Americans were starting to smoke tobacco more and more and were rolling it themselves. And his great-grandfather designed it. And when he comes on campus sometimes for some of these homecomings, I said, this is great. He said, yeah, I always take my daughters to see the building on 33rd Street. And I said, well, that's great. He did that. And didn't your other side of your family invent the cigarette rolling machine? He said, yeah, one designed these beautiful buildings and one designed something that killed millions of people. I said, well, that's one way of looking at it. But yeah.
So it seems like it was clear that students gravitated toward you very early on when you started, and you were pushing the boundaries a lot. So the school, though, kept you engaged. And what do you think it was about the school or Jack Orderman or the general sort of time that made that work?
That's a good question.
Being a sort of a fish out of water in a way.
Well, certainly Jack Orderman was a really important part of it. Because when we started the page, which I hope you'll want to hear about at some point, the newspaper, it was hard-hitting. But like the film, which captured the pulse of the student body, so did the newspaper. A lot of the faculty were very supportive, but a lot of them really thought this is terrible. You know, making these kind of films and in the newspaper, hanging out our dirty laundry, you know, but without Jack Orderman's backing and belief that freedom of expression is important, I would not have been able to go through this.
Did you talk to him about that stuff, or did it?
A little bit.
He just left you alone?
Mostly he did.
Okay.
A lot of people criticized him for kind of a laissez-faire administration, but I thought it was great. We didn't have to talk about it. He was just like behind it. And in fact, when the page became kind of really known.
Take a minute and fix your.
Oh, okay. When it became really known in the community with the 10 private schools, their newspapers were really, I would call it like a milquetoast. They did not upset the apple cart. The Gilman News, that's of course supposed to be the best private school in Baltimore. Their Gilman News was just like, it was like good PR for the school, whereas ours was like drug abuse, you know, sex, abortions and birth control and rock and roll and lots of cheating and things.
But
we covered the great stuff.
Topics that students wanted to talk about.
They wanted to talk about. In fact, one difference, eventually I was made president of Maryland Scholastic Press Association. And I remember meeting with advisors, and one of the big things they had trouble with is our students just aren't interested in reading the newspaper. And I was thinking, well, I was bragging about our students because, well, you were an editor, and you'd have like 20 people on your staff working all night long, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, sometimes with me not here, most times with me not here. So these picking out this fabulous product which won every national award, medalists from Columbia Scholastic Press, all American from National, all Southern, all these. And so, but these teachers, advisors saying, how do you do it? And I said, well, I don't know. But one day I was teaching math and all these kids were running past the door. And I thought, what is it? Is there a fight down on the arcade? What is going on? And I've got to go down and find out what is happening here. And what happened was the printer had delivered the current issue of the page. And they were grabbing issues of it. And I said, that's what you want to do as an advisor. That's what you want your students to produce.
So then let's just talk for a second about how that got started, the page. So you had the Monitor, and then what did you teach journalism first, and then that led to?
No, that's a good question too. So here again, having a wonderful small school and wonderful backing from Jack Orderman, and Sam Williams was head of the upper school, and he was laissez-faire also. So it was very nice if you had ideas you wanted to go with. So the kids who were doing the Monitor said, this is nice and all, but it just comes out 2 or 3 times a year, and it's nothing really current. And I said, well, why don't you do an extra page? Call it the Monitor page or something, and come out every couple of weeks with news. And they did. And it came out with a couple of issues. And then the next year, Ed Weber, who graduated in '78, I believe, became the editor, got a staff of about 4 or 5. And by the next year, we had a staff of 20. And it went on. It went from 4 pages to when you did it, 24 pages, 36-page issues, winning all these awards, and it really grew. And the thing was, it was the students. It wasn't mine. It was the students' achievement. And what goes on from there, venture capitalists today, like John Stewart and George McCullough, you started your own website design business for private schools. And I think that leadership of leaving you to make mistakes and develop this and lead 20 people at 17 or 16, whatever you were, really had to do with your later day success. But mostly it was done for the student body, that their voice would be in this newspaper.
But the journalism class played an integral role.
Yes, and we started that around, the page started in 76, and by about 78, I talked the administration into having a journalism class, which was half boys and half girls, which was great to coordinate. It was really good. And so then they were doing investigative reporting, in-depth reporting. Mark Pellington was our rock critic.
Oh, is that right?
Wonderful reviews of the current rock albums. And that grew and grew and grew. It was kind of actually, they kind of compete to get into the class. And then there was like complaints from every once in a while from teachers, parents saying, she was up till 2 o'clock in the morning working on our story. I'm upset about this. I said, well, I would think it'd be something to be glad about, that she would get that involved in it.
So, do you remember the first time the page caused a stir? Yes.
Yes, there was a column written, I believe by John Stewart in 78 or something, about should the school regulate students' behavior off campus? Okay, and so he cited several instances. One was, there were a couple, but one of them was when the Baltimore Colts won a championship or something, and they were one of the students was at Friendship Airport, now Thurgood Marshall BWI Airport, and he got up on top of a car, was cheering, and he had a St. Paul's jacket on, and that was cited. And then another one was Mr. Darrell, maybe the very finest teacher in the history of the school that I've known. He was somewhere in Green Spring Valley, and he saw a student pour beer on a car or something, and we named him. So when that article came out, we in a few days got a letter from that this man he at this time is involved, he's a big time real estate agent, and they said that this is harmful to his reputation, to his earning a living, all these things, and so we demand a retraction in the next issue. And so I found out about this article because Jack Orderman, the headmaster, calls me in his office. I wore down that carpet many times. And this one was, he shows me this, and I said, oh my God, well, should we print a retraction? He said, well, first, let me check with Mr. Darrell and other people if this incident was true. So he did that.
Wow.
And then he got back, and he showed me the letter he wrote to saying that all that we've checked out shows that this indeed did happen, and this is just a foolish incident of when he was a youth. We can't see it's that kind of, and he sent that back, and we never heard again. And that was the first of many times, but he supported that. I used to apologize and say, oh, Jack, I'm so sorry. He said, no, they're just being, we'll take care of it. And without that support, the students couldn't have run with what they did.
Yeah. Now, in 1978, that would have been early on with coordination with the girls' school.
Yes.
So that must have been in itself pretty unique to have half girls, half boys at the time.
Well, it wasn't quite half, maybe a third. I said half and half. But it was a good substantial mix. And the only other course that had coordination was Bill Bassett's. And Bill Bassett had an AP biology course.
Okay.
Can I say something about Bill Bassett?
Yeah.
Bill Bassett was a fabulous teacher. He came in about 2 years after I did. Sometimes we'd be in faculty meetings, and it was a very staid environment. This is the way St. Paul's is. And I remember I was asking something with Bill in a faculty meeting, and one of the faculty said, why do these new teachers always have to say things? And I thought, we've been here 9 years. When will we not be new? But Bill and I charged forth, and Bill had this fantastic AP biology course and took an annual trip to the Everglades and that was girls and boys.
Okay.
And Bill eventually became head of the upper school, and he was great. And one of the things, as far as the African American history of St. Paul's, is there were maybe 3 or 4 students of color when I was in the upper school from 73 on. And by around mid-80, there weren't a whole lot more. And Bill Bassett thought that we have to attract, it's like a 70% African American city that we're just next to. Why is this such a white school? And so he then said, one thing is we have no black teachers. So he hired the first African American teachers, Leon Holly, in the mid-80s to teach biology. And then it didn't do too much. And then a couple years later he said, we have no African American trustees. We should have that. And so he did. And it still didn't help a whole lot. But then he hired a lady, Beulah Maxwell, who was a retired middle school principal. And she went out to tell the community what we had. And more African American students came here. And some were on scholarship, some were doctors' sons and lawyers' sons and all that. But of course, Bill also did things like for the women teachers on the faculty. They all made less money than the male teachers. None of them had advisees, student advisees. Bill changed that. And then as he got Beulah Maxwell out, more African American participation. And it went from a very far progress to today when the current headmaster is African American, when the student population is a wonderful integration thing. With Bill doing all of this, though, the sad ending was he was shopping at a nearby mall, Towson Mall, and in the parking garage he was shot in the face and killed by 2 teenagers.
Yeah.
So lots of history there.
So back to the coordination with the girls' school. Did you expect, as the journalism class grew and grew, did you see the coordination grow while you were here?
Yeah.
And what was
So
that like to start to see
it was
a more
exciting.
coordinated?
It was exciting. More science courses and math courses and English courses, and in my film course there were girls, and it was always great to get their perspective. I got into trouble once because I gave a talk in chapel where I said that I didn't think the girls' school was as good a school as the boys' school.
I heard about that.
They were
That must have gone over well.
terrible. And the headmaster, Bob Hallett, at the time was just so, Michael, why do you have to say things like this? You shoot from, they're a loose cannon. And I thought, well, that's me. But there were many teachers that I loved there. Jean Nicola, Sandy Durfee, a whole bunch of them. Loved Lila Laura was the headmistress. Many of the girl students whom I loved teaching, and there are some friends today. But I thought at that time, and I hope it's changed, they were good with details and correctness and getting things done and all that. But they weren't as bold in their thinking as those at the boys' school, with the faculty and trustees and students. I understand that's changed today, and there's more of a merger. But at the time, I think I regret having voiced that opinion publicly.
Well, now it's going to be recorded forever.
Oh, good.
So, but one of the things that happened while you were here was the Ward Center, correct? And that must have been a dramatic change in terms of the campus.
The coordination, yes. I remember
I'm correct that you were here when that
Yes,
was
that happened in the early 90s, and it was called Two Schools, One Shared Vision. And that fantastic art center went up, and there was more social and artistic mixing of the girls and boys, and a brilliant head of the art center was Paul Tynes, who came from Choate Rosemary Hall, and the level of the student productions went from like C- to A+, bold. They weren't just doing Rodgers and Hammerstein anymore. They were doing bold kinds of plays. About date rape, about AIDS, about Holocaust, and then great musical productions. And he was just brilliant. And Lillian said in the mid-40s when she came after the war that St. Paul's was always a jock school. And I think up until the 80s it probably still was known as a jock school. But when Paul Tynes came in with that art center that Bob Hallett had the vision for and knew how to raise the money, very great at that.
Mm-hmm.
As you've seen, this whole campus changed mostly because of Bob Hallett from the mid-'80s when he arrived. What Paul Tynes did was, if you wanted to send your kid to a private school, one of the 10 in Baltimore area, for theater, you send them to St. Paul's. And it didn't destroy the sports program. It was just like you had sports and you had theater, but now you had this.
Mm-hmm.
So he was able to do that, and the administration was very good at guiding it.
Now, you performed with Paul Tynes, didn't you?
Yes.
So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
For the 150th anniversary of the school, the sesquicentennial, and there's a lousy book that was written about the history of the school. Oh, you were the author of that. At the same time when that book came out, Linda Knox, who was the middle school librarian under Penny Partlow's great guidance, really, she became head of the sesquicentennial committee. And she developed all kinds of events, ending with fireworks and beer and big party. But she also thought that Paul Tynes and I ought to be in a play called Greater Tuna. And it's a 2-actor play with 20 characters. So you play all kinds of men and women and children and adults. And she directed that with Paul and me. And Paul at this time had moved back to Choate. So this is like 1999.
He came back for the performance.
He came back. We went up there to rehearse. He came down here to rehearse. And it was really nice. The theater was just packed both nights.
Yeah.
Because he was such a big draw. He had such a following. And yeah, so that was a real fun part. I had been gone from the school a couple of years myself at that point.
Now, when you it's the journalism class and the page, all of that evolved over the time. How many years were you here?
21.
21 years.
73 to 94.
And was it? Did you see that the issues that students wanted to talk about in the page or through film studies, did those change over time, or was it the same sorts of things that, like, did it get harder for you to navigate all of that, or you just had the same principles?
Sometimes it was like, oh, you can't print that. We used to get criticism from a couple of faculty members who really hated what we were doing, and I won't mention names, but it was over the years they got used to us. But what was always important, they would say, you let them print anything. I said, first, that's not my paper, it is theirs. But no, there were 4 restrictions. You couldn't print libel or obscenity or anything that would disrupt the school day or invasion of privacy. So I was very strong about that. If it did that, you can't do that. And then, see, things changed. In 1967, there was a protest by students in Des Moines, Iowa, that they were wearing black armbands to protest the killing in Vietnam War. And the principal said you had to take them off. And they said, no. And so they and their parents took them to court, and they won that you could do it. And then the school board took them to the appellate court, and they won. So students have to, this is the school paper, you can't do that. And then they took it all the way to the Supreme Court. And in 1969, in Tinker versus Des Moines, the justices said there is freedom of expression for students in public schools, that they do not shed their American rights at the schoolhouse gate. You are still an American, you still have freedom of expression. But that was only for public schools. So I had to educate, Jack Rorneman and Bob Hallett how important this would be for our school, not only for our paper, but for our school to be open and honest about things and to deal with problems. You know.
So you were, one of the things that makes you unique is that you were able to build, or you built relationships with pretty much, it didn't matter if you were a teacher or an administrator, you had relationships with lots of different people here. Are there certain people that really you remember in terms of your time here, or that you think about or had an impact on you?
Yeah, well, Bill Bassett, I've mentioned.
You mentioned Bill Bassett.
And Penny Partlow was a great librarian and a great friend to this day, because as one of the teachers, Tom Longstreth, said, how she defined her job was not just working with books in the library. It was a center of activity of the campus. Her office, people wanted to come in to exchange ideas, and some of it was gossip, some of it was ideas, and it really set a tone of, excitement. And so that was neat to always check in with her almost every day. Yeah, now Judd Anderson was a philosophy teacher. And one of the things he did, I think, for me and for the students, was when some of the chaplains were out in the hospital. We've had alcoholic chaplains and sick chaplains and all this. And for a while, Judd took over. And he really made it exciting. Chapel, I found mostly boring, and a lot of students did. I cut it a lot, but not when Judd was part of it, Judd Anderson. So he had students running chapel, or he'd ask faculty to speak. This wasn't done very much. And he asked me to speak one year, and I said, "Oh, you don't want me to talk in chapel." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because I doubt all of this. I doubt all of this." He said, "Well, maybe there'll be some people sitting out there that feel like you did." I said, "Well, okay." But I worked on it, and I talked about, I don't believe any of it. But what I believe in are these things, certain principles I try to live by, which I think make you spiritual. Like, number one, never think you're superior to another person. And I went through a bunch of things. And at the end of it, I'm almost teary about this. When I was leaving chapel, the guy who was head of the Spirit Council put his arm around my shoulder and said, "How could you know what I was thinking?" I said, "I didn't know what you were thinking. That was my beliefs, my doubts." But it got me so close to students after that, students who weren't in my class, that it was a really cool thing that Judd did. And Nelson Swagler was a very good part of the school as far as the television techniques and the computer age and math, but he had only a handful of students. There would be like 5 or 6 students in his advanced math. But when Bill Bassett took over, he democratized it more. So I would say, yeah.
Now, it almost feels like the math part of your job was just a small part of why you stayed here and what you, did you enjoy teaching math?
Oh, I did very much. Well, in fact, there were only like 4 members of the math department in the upper school, and I was the only one that actually graduated with a math major in college. They were great teachers, but I was the only one who had a math major. But I didn't have quite the interest they had in calculus and all this, so I taught algebra and geometry. But one thing in my geometry course was I taught critical thinking. And so it was like nothing, anybody could have taught it in any of the courses here, but nobody was doing it. And so I had read this book when I first started teaching called Teaching as a Subversive Activity. And it said one of the most important things you can give your students is to teach them to have bullshit detectors, which today is called critical thinking. And it's taught all over. But in the late 70s, early 80s, this really wasn't being, at least not at St. Paul's, being taught. And so I had a big unit on that. And in fact, when students come back for the homecomings here, the cocktail parties, so often I get, the best thing I got out of high school was that critical thinking. So that was a way to be teaching math, but also have another influence.
Yeah.
And another thing about teaching in the math classrooms was the general way people were teaching before like the early 80s that I could see all about me was there's a teacher in front of the classroom. You're all sitting facing the teacher. I'm the sage on the stage. You are empty vessels that I will fill with knowledge. And the more unfiltered you give it back to me, the more A's you will get. And I thought, this has got to change. And I went to this workshop, something called the National Writing Project, and they talked about cooperative learning. And that students should be given the opportunity to teach. So instead of like 20 kids facing, I'd have 4 or 5 round tables. They're working together cooperatively. They're teaching each other. You don't understand anything as well as when you get to teach it. And they didn't have those opportunities. I'm not, the beginner of all this, but I was one of the only ones doing it at St. Paul's at the time. I'm sorry to brag, but it's now everywhere.
Yeah.
But it was new at that time, things coming in.
So was it hard to stay out of the sports side of St. Paul? I know it wasn't your personal interest, but everybody was asked, all teachers were asked to do a lot.
Right.
And so you filled the gaps with teaching these other activities and things. But were you ever pushed to get into some sport?
I wasn't pushed, but one of the things I did was, and Jack had suggested this, Jack Orderman, yes, go support the games, but don't just do the varsity sports. So I would go to fresh off football games, to the JV wrestling things, and they noticed, because there was only me and a couple of parents, and it got to the point where, and this is bragging again, that at graduation time, in my last year, it's called the Dabney Cruikshank Award, which is given to school spirit. Usually it's given to a student, always given to a student, and a student athlete. And they gave it to me. It's really funny. Somebody who just doesn't like sports a lot, but I did respect what they were doing and tried to support it.
Yeah.
But I never understood what was going on the field.
Now, when you look around the campus now, you walk around, because I know you come back from time to time. Does it surprise you where we are, where the school is, or could you have seen it sort of headed in this way, in terms of the campus, the coordination with the girl, all of the
Yeah, no, it was a progression. It was heading, and Bob though was really, as far as fundraising, he could not be surpassed.
Yeah.
You look at the campus today, the art center, the chapel, the athletic center, the new middle school. These are Bob Hallett. Jack wasn't interested in that. He was great at what he did, but Bob Hallett was good. If he wasn't doing this tap dance and raising this money, you wouldn't have all this.
Now, did you and he ever sort of go head to head on some of the issues that were coming out in the page or the film studies?
Every once in a while. He had an assistant, Chris Dorrance, who was assistant headmaster and also became head of the upper school at one time. And we had a very controversial issue at the page where the varsity lacrosse team had gone to Bermuda to practice during spring break. And at the customs, when they were passing in, one of the students brought like 3 ounces of pot with him. And he was busted and arrested. And the story spread all over in the private school community and all throughout Baltimore. And but then there was like, should we cover this in our next issue? And so we were having the debate, and as luck would have it, the girls and the guys, should this be covered? Bob was walking by, and I said, come in here. And it was a teaching moment. I said, listen to them debating. And they were saying things like, they already think we're a drug school. We do this, it's going to be even worse. And other kids were saying, yes, but every other school is writing about it, and we don't write about it. What does that say about our paper and our school? And Bob listened to this. And at the end of it, he said, if you go with it, we want it to be passed by the school attorneys first before we publish it. And so the week that it was finished being written by Mark Miles, a very good editor and writer, and so Bob and I could have clashed, but mostly merged. And that was really great. And the article ended up winning 5 or 10 national awards.
I remember that.
It was amazing.
It was amazing. Now, you were involved, by being involved in all of these different things, you probably saw all sorts of things about the St. Paul's, and what are there things about the school at the time that you were here that people may not know about, or that you think would be interesting to share? Or
Well, see, with our films and with the newspaper, we've told it all. So
that's good for the video archives.
But I know some of the names, but I've never really checked it out. But no, as far as embezzling or stealing or lying or.
So, did you see this? From when you started to the time that you left, the students, the school got bigger.
Yes.
Did that change the dynamic at all as you?
Well, I think it did. I mean, it's always been, or at least it was founded as, of course, a poor boys' school, for the choir, orphans and all that. And of course, it's not poor boys anymore, or not very many. But it seems, at least from the 60s and 70s, it always was a Republican place. There's a lot of money involved, and with the trustees and with the parents, not so much with the faculty. But so most of the students, I think, to this day are Republican oriented. But you'll always find this group of kind of misfits and rebels and this and that will find their way. I don't know if I see so much of that when I come out, but I don't know them.
Yeah.
But it's exciting to see how it's grown. I mean, Penny Partlow and Jamie Andrew and I took a tour with Jeff Dudley, who's a great development director. And I'm not just saying that, he really is. And so I can see the things he's influenced. And then the walk around, we're not important anymore when we're here. Nobody knows the three of us. But when I see so many students of color, so many young, dynamic faculty, you know, this is exciting. When I was here, the history department, for example, was all right wing. There were 3 or 4 teachers, excellent teachers, but you got only that point of view of history. And the arts development, and the more sports. There's ice hockey, there's this, there's that. So it's alive, but it's really big. It's a little bit scary when you're here if you're not part of it. But it's exciting. It's still probably one of the greatest schools in the area.
So what kept you coming back to St. Paul's? You know, I'm sure there were times when you could have gone to another school or changed job. You know, what got you up in the morning to come back here?
It was the money. I said, no, actually you made less money working in a private school than public school. It was, well, that, like I was saying earlier, this opportunity to try all kinds of things. You know, it just, as Penny Partlow has said, no day was boring. No 2 days were alike. And so you could have an impact, and you could see the results of it. Well, and you know, this Krista McCall, it sounds, you know, hokey, but the astronaut, I touch the future, I teach. And so you think, you know, and then I see these people today. I have a good, bragging, but at least 15 or 20 friends that are friends. I mean, like yourself, that are really good friends. We talk a lot and we do these things. And that started here, and not during here. When they came to class, particularly math, we're on task. You know, I have one friend, Brendan Hunt, who's a lawyer now in New York, great friend. He's been a friend for 25, 30 years. He said, if I had tried to see what you were like in the math class, you were just a bastard. I would never want anything to do with you. But when we worked on the page and on the filmmaking, you really got to know each other, and it was a looser thing. And so it was exciting. It was, no 2 guys were alike. It was exciting.
So there, when you left St. Paul's, you opened up a junk shop.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
So yeah, I was, after I had not retired, I was like young. I was like in my 40s still. Well, I'm still young. But then I had 2 friends, Dwayne, who had been my friend for 2nd grade, and Margot Goldman, were starting a junk shop. And both of their houses were filled with stuff, as mine was. And without planning it or thinking about it, sometime we were at a Christmas mart and somebody said there's a new space on the avenue developed, ready. And I moved from a big house across the street from the zoo on Alcontrelli Terrace to a little house in Hamden. And people kept saying, what are you going to do with all that crap in your house? And finally they said it, and we looked at each other and said, we'll open a shop. So we opened a shop, and that lasted for 25 years. And that was wonderful. And there were no committee meetings and no reports to write. We were our own bosses. There was no money in it, but it was fun.
And it was called Gustafson's?
It originally was called Gustafson's after Greta Garbo. Her real name was Gustafson, because we used her as our logo. And then after a while, nobody knew what the hell that meant. So I came up with the name Hamden Junk, Junque, and it brought in more people. And the really cool thing about it was everybody that came in that shop was either in a good mood or they got in a good mood. So it was wonderful to be there. I only did it 1 day a week. The others did other days. But also it was wonderful, full circle here, was people that I had taught at St. Paul's came in 25 years later with kids and not even recognizing them, but wonderful, wonderful reconnecting.
And you were, as a result, or maybe in what led to that too, is you were very good at yard sales and flea markets and things.
Yes. Well, I'm wearing $8 worth of clothes right now. I really could. I could get this at Nordstrom's for $65. I like this for $2. And I think that was a great joy.
When you go to a yard sale, how do you know that something is worth picking up and taking, or at that point taking back to your shop?
Just knowing what kinds of things people were looking for, any kind of Beatles memorabilia or old Baltimore Natty Bo
You read
stuff.
up a lot of Pee Wee Herman stuff.
Pee Wee Herman was our mascot. So yeah, anything Pee-wee Herman would sell. And I wasn't bilking people occasionally, but usually, if I paid $5 for this, I could get 15 or 20 in the shop and it would pay the rent, and it was fun. So yeah, it was mostly about fun. Yeah, and we made some mistakes. We bought some things that just sat and sat and sat, and eventually you would give it to the family center or something. But mostly it was taking a chance. And
now, was there ever an opportunity to live on campus when you were teaching here?
I did not. Lillian Lorenz lived in one of the gatehouses, and Albie Kaufman, head of the English department, lived in the other one. Those faculty houses, the other ones, other than the gatehouses, were designed by Sam Williams, who was head of the upper school. There's a good 8 faculty houses or something, and he was head of the upper school for I don't know how long. His dad was head of the law school at Washington Lee University. And Sam was a real gentle Southern gentleman, wonderful guy, very bright. And so he designed those houses in addition to heading the upper school until Bill Bassett took over, and then Sam did college guidance. But no, I never wanted to live on campus. It was, I like the students, I love the students, I love the faculty, but I'm real glad to leave them alone. Leave them behind when I go home.
I'm afraid to ask this, but what were some things that you did when you weren't working at St. Paul's?
No comment.
Are there things that I haven't asked you that you think you'd really want to bring up or talk about?
No, well, just as far as background, one thing I did do when I wasn't at St. Paul's, but it was pre-St. Paul's, is my best friend at the time, Bridget, and I went across country on 2 matching motorcycles.
That's right.
So we did that, and we slept on football fields because there was no students in the summer in high schools, cemeteries sometimes. Once a week we'd stay at a campground so we could shower. But for like 2 months we just went across country. We went to Big Sur, and that was a lot of fun. And so I think that influenced who you are.
And did you do that? You did that on motorcycles?
We did it on 2 motorcycles, 2 matching motorcycles, 1971.
Wow.
So yeah.
Anything else? I know you don't like to brag about yourself, but
no, I wouldn't. I would be too modest to say that. But no, it's just it's a great feeling to have been here, to feel that you made an impact, to feel appreciated, and I wish the school the best. There's a great history to it. I was never. One last thing I would like to mention. Well, Penny Partlow, when she started these recollections, these I guess there are now 25 of these recordings. One thing that we had an idea for was I was really never much interested in the history of the school, which I hope this tape will help people who will be interested. But Lewis Clark, who started in 1927, and Lillian Lorenz, who started in 1945, were still alive in 1993 or 4. And Penny and I got one of my film students to do the camera work, and we took them to Mount Washington, where the school was from 1927 to 1952. And we walked around with the camera filming them. And it was a big contrast with the two of them. Lewis was still teaching. He was in his 60-some year of teaching, part-time at this point, but he was, and living on campus. And as we walked around, he said, "Oh, it was mighty fine. Everything was wonderful." When they said, with small faculty, "Lewis, can you teach French?" He said, "Well, I know comment allez-vous, you're the French teacher." And then when we asked Lillian, "What was St. Paul's like when you came here?" She said, "It was a dump. It was a moldy dump." But we're walking around this campus. The gym, the Consolving Gym, is still there. The house where Lewis said he was the first faculty member allowed to marry. So the school was 1849, 1927, he married Helen Clark, and the house they lived in is still there. But the manor house, where the school mostly was, and there's a famous drawing of it by Don Swan. He does a lot of Washington Monument, very famous scenes, and there was that manor house that we filmed. Well, not less than a month later, I went back to Mount Washington, and it was leveled, not a shingle.
Right.
I thought, this is Twilight Zone, but we have it recorded. And now it is a senior living place, Springwell. They never call these places last stop or final exit, but Springwell is now where St. Paul's was. And then Lillian helped with the move here from 52 to get to Brooklynwood.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for making time.
Well, thank you for your interest.